I now have the honor of introducing our keynote speaker for the afternoon. Dr. Clarence B. Jones has an intimidating and inspiring resume. Indeed, his life is one that weaves of the very fabric of American life over the last several decades. In a distinguished and heralded career, Dr. Jones has served as political advisor, counsel, and speechwriter for Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., was the first African-American partner in a Wall Street investment banking firm, advised governments around the world, an author several times over, and is a distinguished professor at Stanford University, among other accomplishments. During the Civil Rights Movement, Dr. Jones coordinated the legal defense of Dr. King and other members of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference against libel claims filed against them and the New York Times by officials in Birmingham, winning a landmark Supreme Court case in the process. Notably, he assisted in drafting the celebrated "I Have a Dream" speech given by Dr. King, and he went on to help negotiate the end of the Attica prison inmate rebellion in 1971. I could go on and on and on, but I encourage you to read a more full bio in your programs, but I think that we would all be best served from hearing from the man himself. So therefore, it's my pleasure to introduce to you Dr. Clarence B. Jones.
I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. I woke up this morning with my mind set on freedom. Hallelujah, hallelujah, hallelujah. In 12 years and 4 months, from 1956 until April 4th, 1968, the date of his assassination, with the exception of President Abraham Lincoln and the Emancipation Proclamation of 1863, Martin Luther King Jr. may have done more to achieve political, social justice, racial equality in the United States of America than all other events or persons in the previous 400-year-plus history of the United States. He was the preeminent apostle of nonviolence, love, and a personal commitment to the pursuit of excellence. I am especially pleased and honored to be with you today because I have, before your invitation and then after your invitation, I refreshed my own recollection about the history of Masons in the United States, even outside the United States, and the Grand Masons here in the District of Columbia. There is a stanza out of a song titled "Lift Every Voice and Sing." And one of those stanzas reads, "We have come over a way with tears that with tears have been watered. We have come treading our path through the blood of the slaughter. Out from the gloomy past till now we stand at last, where the white gleam of our star is cast." The great gospel songwriter James Cleveland reminds us, nobody told us or told me the road would be easy. But Lord, I don't believe you brought me this far just to leave me. Today is the best day of my life. I was just told that. So, as I pause with you on your day of thanksgiving and remembrance, I think it is important that we do just that. That is, to give thanks to those things, events and persons that have enriched your life. And whether today, yesterday, last week, last month, last year, or several years ago, take a moment to remember and reflect on those things, persons, and events that made it possible for you to endure and be here today. Now, I know there are competing outlooks. Sometimes I refer to them as ideological outlooks about what, if anything, or who, if anyone, may have partially or decisively been responsible for whatever you may regard as your success today. Some of you may believe that I'm so good, I'm so super bad, I just outperformed everybody else. That's why I'm so successful today. I don't owe my success to anyone but me. My hard work, my tenacity, my ingenuity, brains and guts. Others may have a more balanced and modest evaluation of the reasons for their current success. One of the more laudable things about the Grand Masons in general, and in particular about the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, is that you made the question of who and what was responsible for an individual's success almost irrelevant. Your actions and commitments to community services elevated the importance of group and collective assistance, recognizing but subordinating individual accomplishment, but for the benefit of your entire communities. I teach a 15-week course, From Slavery to Obama, at the University of San Francisco. This year, for the first time, it is being offered online. The syllabus for the course which I wrote says, and I quote, "In his epic treatise, The Souls of Black Folk," published in 1903, renowned sociologist and historian Dr. W.E. Du Bois, commenting on the legacy of slavery in our country, said, "The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line." More than 100 years after he wrote those words, the racial struggles in the United States remain the most pervasive theme in our history. Slavery, the Civil War, and nearly a century of racial segregation stand as stains on the moral fabric of the United States. Notwithstanding the election and re-election of America's first African-American president of the United States, frank discussions on race relations in America and the historical impact of the institution of slavery upon our current society remain problematic. The events in Ferguson, Cleveland, Baltimore, Staten Island, New York, Charleston, South Carolina, in 215 indicate a phrase which I penned for Dr. King in the first 7 paragraphs of his I Have a Dream speech, indicate a fierce urgency of now for our nation, once and for all, to confront the reality of the consequential impact of the legacy of slavery upon the current attitudes and conduct of the descendants of slaves and slaveholders. Through an in-depth examination of the long history of white supremacy and the black struggle against it, this course is designed to enable honest and critical discussion about race in America. Readings, lectures, and activities will focus on those events and individuals that have decisively shaped and influenced America's efforts to abolish slavery and address its historical consequences and subsequent efforts to create a society based on values of racial equality and social justice. Martin Luther King Jr. was a strategic political genius. He knew that no matter how compelling the case on the merits is or was, that there was no way that merely 12 to 14% of the population, Negroes as we were referred to in the 1960s, was going to impose that point of view on the majority of the white population. 12% of the population, no matter how compelling the case was on the merits, was not going to impel a point of view on 88% of the people. The only way that there would be any fundamental transformation on the central issue of race in America at that time was when a majority of the 88% of white people came to understand that it was in their self-interest that racial segregation end. Great history, magnificent history of struggle of African Americans in the United States. But the extent to which we were able to transform America depended upon the extent to which the conscience of the majority of our fellow citizens could be aroused and could be motivated to want to make America a better place. So this is one way, as I mentioned, the course that I teach. I parochially contend that today, neither African Americans or other persons in our country can possibly understand how and why America thinks, talks, writes about race and race relations today unless they have studied the institution of slavery, its doctrine of white supremacy, and their joint consequential impact on the subsequent and the current generation of descendants of slaves and slaveholders. My deceased friend and mentor, Dr. John Hope Franklin, writes in his landmark classic, From Slavery to Freedom, that there were a cluster of 3 events that heralded the age of militant abolition against slavery. The first was the publication of David Walker's Appeal in 1829. The second was the inaugural issuance of William Lloyd Garrison's newspaper, The Liberator, in 1831. And the third was the insurrection of the former slave, Nat Turner, that same year. Walker, in his appeal, thundered, "Are we men, I ask you, are we men? Did our Creator make us to be slaves to dust and ashes like ourselves?" On January 1st, 1831, the first issue of Garrison's The Liberator appeared. Garrison, like Walker, cited the Declaration of Independence and demanded the immediate end of slavery, arguing that black people were as much entitled to liberty, life, and the pursuit of happiness as white people. For Garrison, the swift and unconditional abolition of slavery was the only solution. He challenged slavery in dramatic words. I met Martin Luther King Jr. in February 1960. I was 29 years old, and he was 31. I had just a half a year earlier, graduated from Boston University Law School after having served in the United States military during the Korean War. Dr. King had been indicted by the state of Alabama for tax evasion, lying on his state income tax returns. He was represented by a distinguished African-American judge by the name of Judge Hubert Delaney, a brother of the famous Delaney sisters. Judge Delaney called me one Thursday evening and he said, "Clarence," I was living in California. I just moved to California about 6 months earlier in order to commence a career in entertainment law, because I had done very well in copyright and intellectual property law at Boston University Law School. He says, "Clarence, you know, this preacher, Martin Luther King Jr., has been indicted by the state of Alabama for tax evasion and perjury on his state income tax returns. And I'm calling you because I want you to be responsible for doing the legal research of the defense." So I thought when he first talked to me that he was talking about going to the law library and doing the research and sending it to him. And he said, no, Clarence, you don't understand. No. I want you to be my chief law clerk, but you have to go to Montgomery, Alabama. So I listened, and he says, "Yeah, you'll be there about 4 to 6 weeks." And I said, "I'm sorry, Judge, I just can't do that." Well, he was very, very disappointed in me. And it was very difficult for me to say no to Judge Hubert Delaney. He had been somewhat a mentor to me. He had recommended me to law school after I'd gotten out of the Army, etc. And then early the next morning, Friday morning, early California time, I get another call from the judge, and this time he says, "Clarence, at the time of our conversation last night, I did not know it, but Dr. King, he is on his way to California now. He has a speaking engagement on Saturday at the World Public Affairs Council, and on Sunday he's going to be speaking at a prominent church, I understand the most prominent church in Baldwin Hills in Los Angeles." And I said to him, I got a chance to talk to him before he left, I said to him that the very most important thing you can do when you land on the ground is to call Clarence Jones. So I thought to myself, the judge doesn't give up. But, how do I say no? That I don't want to meet somebody. So I said, "Judge, yes." Now this is February 1960. Now, in February 1960, Dr. King had already, after the Montgomery bus boycott, had been on the cover of Time, Look, and Life magazine. He had been, in classic terms, 2015 terms, an amalgamation of George Clooney, Michael Jackson, Denzel Washington, superstars, Matt Damon. When I told my wife at the time, who was deceased, she was like, unbelievable. He's coming to our house? Yes. As I said, I never met or talked to Dr. King before. He comes into my home, sits down at a coffee table, some snacks that my wife had prepared, and he leans over across the coffee table and he says, you know, Mr. Jones, we have lots of white lawyers from the Northeast and Midwest who help us in our work to be free, to end segregation in the South. But what we need, Mr. Jones, are young Negro lawyers like you. And Judge Hubert Delaney's told me so much about you. I've just come here and plead that you would come and help us. So I paused for a moment and I said, you know, Dr. King, Judge Delaney did tell me something about what you're doing, and I listened to you today, but I am just simply sorry. I cannot go to Montgomery, Alabama. I'm so sorry. I cannot do it. He is crestfallen. He asked me some questions about myself. You know, he wanted to find out who I was. So I said, well, you know, I was an only child. My parents were living domestic household servants. And by the time I was age of 6, they didn't have their own house. So I was put in a Catholic boarding school from the ages of about 6 to 14. And so in short, I was raised from those years, from 6 to 14, by white Irish Catholic nuns under the Order of the Sacred Heart and the Blessed Sacrament. Graduated from high school, number 1 in my class, went on to Columbia University with an academic scholarship. And my mother, she never lived to see me graduate from college or from law school, or never lived to see her first grandchild. And that I had been drafted and I was bitter about that experience, and so forth and so forth. So he leaves. And my wife turns to me and she says, what do you think you are doing that's so important that you cannot help this man that traveled all this distance to ask for your help? And so I got into my young lawyer's stance. I said, her name was Ann. I said, Ann, that is simply factually incorrect. He has speaking engagements this weekend, and Judge Delaney spoke to him and suggested that since he was going to be out here, he should come and see me. And besides, just because some Negro preacher got his hand caught in a cookie jar stealing, that ain't my problem. And if he wasn't guilty, he wouldn't have been indicted. She says, I don't believe you. She says, but that's the way so I said, that's the way I feel. So as I write in my book, that was a cold night in the Jones household that night. The next morning, Saturday, I get another call. Only this time, the voice on the other end of the phone is dripping saccharin sweet with honey. Mr. Jones, yes. My name is Dora McDonald, yes. Mr. Jones, you know Dr. King enjoyed his visit so much with you and Mrs. Jones, but he forgot. He forgot to invite you to be his guest. He's speaking tomorrow in the Baptist church, and he wants you to be his guest. So she gave me all the details. So I go the next day to this church, Baldwin Hills. I had never seen or heard Dr. King speak. Now, sometimes many years ago, I used to be a little defensive about saying that, but I said, hold on. I mean, you know, when I was in law school after being in the Army during the Korean War, I was in a law school from 1956 to 1959. I was a little older than some of the other people in my class because I'd been in the military. I wasn't interested in anything except getting through law school. And yeah, I heard about this man, Dr. King. I didn't pay any attention to him because I'm trying to get through what I'm going to get through. And he is introduced by the resident pastor. As I said, never heard Dr. King speak before. He gets up and he says, "Ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, the text of my sermon today is the role and responsibility of the Negro professional to aid our less fortunate brothers and sisters who are struggling for freedom in the South." So I thought to myself, this is one smart dude, because he had come to the right church, right place to come. Now, I had never, as I said, never heard him speak. And what he did was he recounted what he said to me in my home across the coffee table, but in much greater detail, a much greater texture. It was compelling. It was mesmerizing. I had never heard any person, any human being walking on two legs with a voice speak like that ever. And then in the midst of this powerful sermon, he pauses and he says, for example, there's a young man sitting in this church today. My friends in New York, for whom I have great respect, tell me that this young man, a young lawyer, that when this man, that this man's brain has been blessed by Jesus, that when this man goes into the law library that looks for the law to solve any problem, he goes all the way back to the time of 1066, the Magna Carta and William the Conqueror. And then, my friends in New York, for whom I have great respect, tell me that when this young lawyer writes down what he finds, the words are so compelling, they just jump off the page. So I'm thinking to myself, I'm thinking opportunistically, because I've only been in Los Angeles 6 or 7 months, and the description bears no rational relationship to me. So I'm thinking, when this sermon is over, I'm going to find out who this young man is, because he can be of some help to me. And then he pauses again. He said, but you know, I had an opportunity to meet this young man in his home in Altadena the other day. I said, oh, Lord. And then he told 1,500 strangers what I had told him about my life and my parents. And then he said, you know, his parents were domestics. His mother was a house maid and a cook. His father was a chauffeur. But he has forgotten from whence he came. So, and then he did something very, very unfair. There is a poem. If you don't know it, you can go online and you can check it out. It's a poem by Langston Hughes. The poem is a letter of a mother to son, letter of a mother to son, mother-son letter. I can't remember the name of it, but it's a letter of a mother to son. And in the letter, he quotes portions of the letter, only he takes poetic license. The poem is about a Negro woman working in a house and scrubbing the stairs and pausing. And as she pauses, she says, I'm doing this for you, son. Don't you give up. Life ain't been no crystal stair. Well, when he did that, I began to tear up, because I had like a video picture of my mother, particularly in her uniform, and I started to cry quietly in my pew. Sermon is over. As I said, he was very popular. He's standing on the steps of the pulpit, signing autographs. And as he sees me walk over to him, he says, you know, I never mentioned your name, Mr. Jones. I never mentioned your name. And then as I continue walking over to him, he says, you know, sometimes we Baptist preachers, I never mentioned your name, Mr. Jones. You never mentioned your name. I didn't say a word. I just walked up to him, took my left arm and grabbed his right shoulder and arm and took my right hand and put it in his right hand, pulled him close to me. And I said, Dr. King, when do you want me to go to Montgomery, Alabama? That is what I call the making of a disciple. So, here we are in 2015, and I always liked, particularly when I knew I was coming to speak with you, I always like to try to frame a state of mind, not only for you, but those who went before you, those people in our country who really cared, like the William Lloyd Garrisons, particularly those white people who cared. Abolitionists, they were called. $600,000 Americans died in the Civil War. More than 35,000 of whom were African Americans. Additionally, President Lincoln awarded 25 Congressional Medals of Honor to African American soldiers for their valor in military services during the war. So I often think, what must the people of goodwill, particularly white people of goodwill, in addition to the hopes of Negroes, as we would call them, what must they have thought when Congress met in December 1965, following Lincoln's assassination earlier that April, and they learned the results of the congressional elections. The newly elected Southerners included the former vice president of the Confederacy, 4 Confederate generals, 5 Confederate colonels, 6 Confederate cabinet officers, and 58 members of the Confederate Congress. What must your ancestors, my ancestors, who opposed slavery thought in 1877 when they heard that the resolution of the disputed presidential election of 1876 would require the removal of federal troops from the South? What must they have felt when they learned that Rutherford B. Hayes, presidential candidate of Lincoln's Republican Party, had agreed to remove such troops in exchange for the Democratic Party's candidate, Samuel Hilden, ending his challenge in the House of Representatives to Hayes' election, thereby assuring Rutherford B. Hayes the presidency. The disappointment of our ancestors with the withdrawal of federal troops from the South in 1877 is poignantly depicted in the novel Freedom Road by Howard Fass and his description of the protagonist, Gideon Jackson's disappointment and death at the hands of the Klan as he tried to defend himself and his family. Or what did they think when the landmark Civil Rights Act of 1875 was gutted by the Supreme Court? In 1883, when it held that the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was not constitutional under the 13th and 14th Amendments. The court established the state action doctrine, thereby allowing segregation and discrimination by private persons in commerce and accommodations to continue. I respectfully suggest to you that you cannot come realistically together on this day of Thanksgiving and remembrance of the lives of your families and neighbors in your respective communities, but asking yourselves, What are we now doing in real time or going to do about the threats of those cherished rights whose receipt was paid for in blood and tears? Masons here and across the country were, as they frequently say in Baptist churches, were determined to make a way out of no way. Masons in the latter part of the 18th century, 19th and 20th centuries looked to their collective talents to ensure and guarantee a life for themselves and their families. Whether they chose to take leadership for William Lloyd Garrison, Dr. William Du Bois, Booker T. Washington, Claude McKay, Elaine Locke, Ida B. Wells, Frederick Douglass, Richard Allen, or Henry Garner, or whoever they took. And who among us today, as we are gathered, as I sat and watched and listened to that young choir, can we forget about the extraordinary singular leadership of such religious and moral leaders in our community, like Henry Fosdick, like Eugene Dalberg, who had been the president of the University of Notre Dame, like Rabbi Joachim Prinz, the president of the American Jewish Congress, who was the person who spoke immediately before Dr. King was introduced to give his I Have a Dream speech. And among the things he said, when I was a rabbi in Hitler Germany, in Berlin, I remember many things. I remember the hatred. I remember the bigotry. But the thing that I most remembered, he said, was the silence of the good people. How can we ever forget just the 20th century? 1,000 or more principally white college students who assembled in Oxford, Ohio, in order to go to the state of Mississippi to devote their summer to registering unregistered Negroes in the state of Mississippi, the so-called summer of 1964. 3 of them lost their lives. James Chaney, who was from Mississippi, Michael Schwerner, and Andrew Goodman from New York. His brother, David Goodman, today beautifully gives me an honor which I believe is in question. He refers to me as his now older brother, because he remembers when his brother and the other 2 boys were missing. The first person they called was Dr. King. And Dr. King asked me to go by and see the families. And David was only 17 at the time. And I will ever forget the pain and anguish etched on the faces of those parents. Well, some of you might be saying, well, who does that Dr. Jones think he is, coming into our sacred space and asking all these questions? Hey, it's a risk of inviting a guest. You better check him out first. See what he's going to say. My questions are prompted by the voice of that great human being whom I mentioned before, who often whispers in my ear, and many other persons I call heroes, wintertime soldiers. Among them was my dear, beloved friend of 30 years, Julian Bond, whom I knew since he was 19 years of age. So, I speak to you, and I accepted your invitation, principally because I felt I had no choice. When he was assassinated on April 4th, 1968, he was 39. Had he lived, he would have been 87 this January. His birthday was 1 week before mine. Assuming Providence continues, this coming January I will be 85. And I am so blessed, but I do not take it for granted. And so, my charge to you, as you gather in this place, is that you give thanks and remembrance on this 10th day of October in Washington, D.C., to what you have received and what you have done, and in honoring the members of those who are no longer with you. Because by doing so, this is consistent with the injunction of that old African proverb, which reminds us that, quote, that if surviving lions don't tell their stories, the hunters will get all the credit. As surviving lions, you have a lot to be proud of. Thank you so much.